Radio, I'm Christina Onnested. The clock is ticking with less than 2 weeks to go before the U.S. is projected to default on its national debt. Congressional leaders will meet with President Joe Biden at the White House today. Early outlines of a potential deal are beginning to emerge to lift the nation's borrowing power, despite slow negotiations. But expectations are low for an agreement due to Republican demands for social spending cuts and Democrats' opposition to it. Catherine Carley has more.
House Speaker Kevin McCarthy says President Joe Biden would rather the U.S. default on its bills than reach a deal with Republicans.
I would hope that he'd be willing to negotiate for the next 2 weeks so we could actually solve this problem and not take America on the brink.
McCarthy is scheduled to resume talks with President Biden today. Lawmakers have until June 1st to reach a deal. I'm Catherine Carley for Pacifica Network and Public News Service.
The meeting takes place ahead of the president's trip to the Group of Seven summit in Japan. Reuters is reporting Ukraine's Supreme Court is facing a large-scale corruption probe. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine is launching the investigation, calling it a large-scale probe. It also released photograph of dollars neatly lined up on a sofa. Local media is reporting one Chief Justice has been detained on suspicion of receiving a $3 million bribe. Meanwhile, leaders from across Europe are heading towards Iceland for a rare summit of the 46-nation Council of Europe that will once step up support for member state Ukraine and condemn expelled Russia for inflicting war on its neighbor. The two-day summit of Europe's main human rights body will be centering on providing legal and judicial means to go after the Kremlin. By Wednesday's conclusion, leaders at the summit want to have the outlines of a system in place to set up a register of all the damage already caused by Russia's forces in Ukraine, so Moscow could be held liable for compensation to victims later. In the U.S., the number of migrants encountered at the U.S.-Mexico border has fallen some 50% during the last 3 days compared to days leading up to the end of Title 42, the pandemic-era regulation that expelled migrants at the border. Here's Homeland Security's Assistant Secretary for Border and Immigration Policy, Blas Nunez Nieto.
The message that there are consequences in place at the border is an important one that we hope is resonating, and we also believe that our foreign partners are undertaking key actions in their countries that are helping as well.
For 3 years, the U.S. had used the pandemic as a way to quickly expel migrants and asylum seekers from the country. That authority expired Thursday midnight. But before it did, the Biden administration rolled out strict immigration restrictions, and many migrants rushed to enter the U.S. before those restrictions kicked in. Immigrant rights advocates, including the ACLU, sued to challenge those new restrictions, arguing they're modeled after failed Trump-era policies courts have already struck down. The head of the artificial intelligence company that makes ChatGPT is set to testify before congressional lawmakers today as they call for new rules to guide the rapid development of artificial intelligence technology. OpenAI CEO Sam Altman is scheduled to speak at a Senate hearing. His San Francisco-based startup rocketed to public attention after it released late last year ChatGPT, a free chatbot tool that answers questions with convincingly human-like responses. Concerns have mounted about the latest generative AI tools that could be used to mislead people, spread falsehoods, violate copyright protections, and upend some jobs. Consumer debt in the U.S. rose to an all-time high in the first quarter this year due to increases in interest rates. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York says debt increased in the U.S. to $17 trillion, a $1 trillion increase since last year. Meanwhile, the Biden administration says it will begin student loan repayments after a 3-year pandemic pause. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to take up a gerrymandering case in South Carolina. Catherine Carley reports.
The Supreme Court will determine whether South Carolina racially gerrymandered one of its congressional districts. A district court ordered new maps be drawn in January after finding the state's first congressional district was drawn by Republicans to dilute the power of black voters. Democratic Representative Joe Cunningham represented the district for one term.
If this map right here passes, South Carolina will be left with 0 competitive congressional districts. 0.
The High Court will take up the case in the fall. I'm Catherine Carley for Pacifica Network and Public News Service.
I'm Christina Onnested reporting for Pacifica Radio.